Hey y'all, it's Ashley at Bookishrealm, and there's so much going on outside right now. Like, I hate when I sit down to film and there's like so much extra crap going on, and then the crickets are going crazy because God forbid it hasn't rained in 12 hours. They're going absolutely wild because it has not rained in 12 hours, and it rains almost every single day. Today was like the one day it didn't rain, and they're going like batshit crazy. So if you hear them outside, please don't hold it against me. Hold it against the universe, because I have nothing to do with that. Anyway, if you're looking at the title of this video, you're probably like, oh my gosh, Ashley's here to do kind of like a hot take. And really, honestly, it's not really a hot take. I am here to have a discussion. I just think that this is a question that a lot of people have asked. And so I am here to not exclusively tackle this question, but to discuss it and present some viewpoints that I kind of align myself with and open up the doors for y'all to share your viewpoints about it. I actually have seen this question come up a lot in the library community. I'm sure it's happened in the booktube community as well, no doubt about that, because we constantly have conversations about authors who are writing characters who don't share their identity and writing it in very harmful ways. Clearly they didn't talk to anybody in the community. Clearly there were no sensitivity readers. So we have had these discussions. I know that it's becoming a big question in the library world in how we look at diversity and how we market things as being diverse, which comes as an interesting crossroads to people no longer using the term own voices to identify books because of the harm that it has caused communities, especially the queer community. So all of this is kind of like muddled together. So this is the first time that I'm actually really heavily talking about this on my channel. I have had this conversation actually in my professional life. I was asked a while ago now. It's had to be now over a year ago. I was asked to speak at a graduate course for a library program, and they asked me to speak to some of the students. It was actually a fairly large class, come to think of it. All of this was via Zoom or whatever the case may be, but I did end up speaking to a graduate class, and I did some preparation for the class and wanted to really look at what it meant when people were asking this question. When people were like, well, why can't people just write what they want to write? Like, why do we want to gatekeep someone's ability to write a diverse cast, even if they do not share the same identity as those characters? And so I started looking at some articles and stuff like this, and I came across an article that was published in a Hornbook in 1998, and it was done by Jacqueline Woodson. And I'll be sure to link any article that I mentioned. I'll be sure to link it down in the description box below. Jacqueline Woodson is love of my life. I adore Jacqueline Woodson. She's amazing. If you've never read a Jacqueline Woodson book, you need to pick one up. She writes for children, teens, middle grade, adults. She does it all. And she's best friends with Jason Reynolds. So, you know, they run in the same circle, of course. But that's beside the point. She published this article in the Hornbook in 1998, and one of the things that she talked about extensively in this article is the fact that she was asked, did she think it was okay for white people to write about BIPOC individuals? And so there's a lot to unpack in that question. First of all, why do you feel the need to ask a black person this question? And so she talks extensively about that, but then she delves into the whole idea of when authors want to write characters who do not share their same identity, you have to ask yourself why. Why do you want to tell this story? What are you aiming to do by telling this story? So she talks about even her own experience writing If You Come Softly, which was originally published in 1998, but you probably have seen the newer version of it because it got repubbed with a new cover. The new cover is absolutely gorgeous, but it features an interracial relationship between a black main character and a white Jewish character. And so she explained how she came about writing this story, even though she is not white or Jewish or a male. And it's very interesting how she walks through the process of how she has thought about her own identity and how it had some intersecting experiences with those who shared those specific identities. And so I highly recommend reading that. But the thing that stood out to me most is the question of why do you want to tell the story? And she also talked a little bit about an author that I don't know whether they were at a conference or something, and she had talked to this author who had written a book about Black characters, and she asked, well, what made you write these characters? Where did you get this idea, this experience? Like, did you interview like Black people? Like, did you spend time with Black people? And it was like, well, I kind of drew on the experience for a Black family that used to work for my family. And so I can't even repeat exactly what she said, because it was just so eloquent the way she put it, where it was simply like, so you were writing from a group of characters that had to come to your table, but you weren't willing to take the opportunity to go into their world. You weren't willing to step into their world. You wrote from the perspective of them being a part of your world and not wanting to dive into what they were experiencing, which is a huge thing to think about it from that lens. You're writing from the lens of someone being a part of your experience in your world and not being a part of theirs. And so that can be dangerous and harmful. I think we talk about it a lot in the booktube community, where you have particularly white authors who will write characters or about experiences, about identities that they do not have, and for some unintentionally write harmful content. And that's because no one from that community has really been able to preview this work. There were no sensitivity readers. There was not extensive research done. And even then, so I'm going to reference another article, because one of the things that people like to come back with is, well, what if someone does extensive research? So the way I found this was really, really complicated and confusing. So I found an article on Tor.com. This article was published just 2 years ago in 2020. And in this article, the writer talks specifically about how they wanted to write a fantasy that was inspired by Chinese culture, and they felt like they were going to be fine because of the fact that they had studied Chinese culture. It was a part of their major and they were well versed in it. I don't remember if they said they had traveled or whatever, but so they felt like it was secure enough for them to be able to write this book. And as they went through the writing process and they kept thinking about it, they were like, hold on. Even with me knowing everything that I do, I still don't feel comfortable writing this story. And so a lot of people would look at that as saying like, oh, when are we going to stop with this whole thing about cultural appropriation? And I like the way that this writer framed it, is that it's about the fact that publishing for so long has been gatekeeping who's been able to tell their story. And so as white writers, you have to ask yourself, have people who actually experienced, who lived these identities, have they had the opportunity to tell their own stories? And if they haven't, should I be the first one to write this story? And so I liked that this character, getting this confused. I like that this author took the opportunity to really examine, even with the knowledge that they had, thinking about publishing as a whole and thinking that, yes, I may have the knowledge. Has this community been given ample space to be able to tell their narrative? And what can I bring to the table that they can't? And Jacqueline Woodson also speaks to that a little bit in the article that she wrote. What can I bring to the table, or what can I bring to the conversation that this group cannot? And often it's not really anything. So I like that it takes this whole idea of gatekeeping and cultural appropriation. Yeah, that definitely can happen. But at the same time, it's think about what literature has always been, the stories that literature has always told, and think about the people who have lived these experiences that have not been given the space and time to write these stories. And so this article, which is why I said this gets so complicated, when I was reading this article, it linked me to another article, which was a guest of honor speech it was at WizCon. Before we jump into that article, I also want to talk about the fact that in this Tor.com article, which I liked, is that they also talked heavily about the fact that people want to read about experiences of other groups, especially those who have not had the time to tell their stories from a dominant group that makes them feel comfortable. It doesn't necessarily challenge the way that they have felt. It doesn't make them uncomfortable. Whereas, you know, reading a white author writing about the Black experience is going to be very tamed down from what I think you'll get from a Black author. And so you want that white author writing about that Black experience because they're going to coach you and hold your hand through it. Whereas you have a Black author who's not going to coach you, hold your hand, or make it easy on you. Do we still have issues with that? Yes. That's a whole conversation for a different day. I'm not going to say that there aren't Black authors that write for the white gaze because it does happen. And so I really liked that they did heavily talk about that. So what they came to in all of this in the conclusion and looking at so many different factors is that they wanted to be able to write a book that had representation without cultural appropriation. So it takes a lot of careful writing in order to do something like this, which is where I do think things like sensitivity readers and checking in with the groups that you are writing about, that's why that becomes such a vital part of the writing experience, especially when you start to include major characters that are not a part of your lived experience. You don't share the same lived experience. So going back, basically that article ended up taking me to another article, which was WisCon, and it was a guest of honor speech done by Hiromo Goto, and they are a writer and an editor. This speech was done in 2014, and so I'm not going to go through the entire speech, but there are a set of questions that I will post them kind of in front of my face so you can get a better visual, but there are set of questions that they ask, and I'm going to start from the section where it says, however, I'm okay with saying that it is my hope that white writers who are interested in writing about cultures and subjectivities outside of their own consider very carefully: 1, how many writers from the culture you wish to represent have been published in your country writing in the same language you will use, i.e. English, to write the story? Why do you think you're the best person to write this story? 3, who will benefit if you write this story? 4, why are you writing this story? 5, who is your intended audience? And 6, if the people/culture you are selecting to write about has not had enough time historically and structurally to tell their story first on their terms, should you be occupying this space? I can't tell you how important those 6 questions are, because if writers would take those 6 questions, specifically white writers, and yes, it does happen that there are BIPOC writers who write about white characters, but you have to think about this in the terms of how publishing has worked. The dominant aspects of publishing, who has constantly been highlighted. You have to think about that. And so these 6 questions to me become super vital in writing about characters that don't share your identity, because then it becomes a story of, or becomes a question of, why are you writing this? What makes you think that you have the authority and the right to write about this? And there have been authors who do write outside of their lived experience, but I promise you they do a whole lot of research. They acknowledge that it is not their lived experience and that these are the people and sources that should be consulted. I just read a middle grade graphic novel not too long ago, last month, called The Legend of Auntie Po. And this book explicitly explores the experiences of Chinese immigrants who work on or in lumber, I think it's like lumber camps or logging camps. They cut down trees, get them into logs, all types of stuff like that, whatever. And so the author of this book specifically acknowledged that they did not include Native or Indigenous characters in the framework of this book because of the fact that they felt like it was not their story to tell. They acknowledged that yes, they existed during this time. They would have interacted with the characters in the book because the characters were Chinese, they were Black characters, and also white characters, and they explicitly stated why they did not include Native and Indigenous characters. And so stuff like that, I think, is extremely vital, even though they didn't necessarily write too heavily about anyone else's experience outside of having a shared identity with the main characters. I think that in doing stuff like this, it shows that you have done the research, you've taken the time to talk to the individuals that you need to talk to who have that experience before you sit down and you write that story. And I think another author who's been really good about doing stuff like this, Linda Sue Park, often writes historical fiction that in children's historical fiction that doesn't necessarily deal with her own lived experience, but the research and the sensitivity reads that go into a lot of Linda Sue Park's books, it shows it heavily shows that there are a lot of different aspects that go into crafting her works. And so for me, one of the hugest things that I think I've been noticing in publishing, especially now in the job that I do, and what I struggle with so much with now, is diversity for the sake of diversity, especially coming from authors who do not have that experience. It's very telling. I just read a book, Jumper, which I did not care for because I did not think that the sapphic representation was good at all. I think it was checkbox because this is a thing that we are now encouraging. You need to write diversely, you need to have diverse characters, but when the effort on the back end, and this is my opinion, you can feel free to disagree, I feel like when the effort on the back end is not well researched, it's not in, you know, working with said community, it shows. And then the book becomes harmful. And then it's like, you only did this because you know that diversity now sells. And so now we are starting to question the authenticity of diversity. Like, is it, I have a video where I talk about this. Is diversity becoming simply a buzzword? It is a good thing because we have these voices that have never been heard, that are getting the opportunity to tell their stories. But then now you start to see on the market where things are being sold for the diversity, and then you read the story and you're like, yo, this is harmful, this isn't good. The Charm Offensive was another one that everybody seemed to love, and I did not care for the Charm Offensive because we had an Indian main character who you did not know. You completely forgot that the character was Indian until you get to the end and you meet his parents. There was no distinguishing qualities, cultural aspects, nothing that identified or showed that this character was Indian. You just literally said he was Indian because, hey, then it became an interracial romance. That's harmful. That's harmful. I felt the same thing with One to Watch. That was another one that was checkbox. We're just going to add as much diversity as possible. Say that this character's black, this character's Asian, this character's bisexual, whatever the case may be, so that we have this rep in the book and it looks good, when literally your characters could be anybody because there's nothing that distinguishes them from anyone else, and it's clear that you have not talked to anybody from these communities to make them fully rounded. And that's also a pitfall of using diverse characters as a means to sell a book. Your characters never end up being well-rounded. I promise you they don't. I have never read a book where the diversity representation was bad and the characters were well-rounded. Even in the book that I just read, Jumper, character was not well-rounded. The character was only her disability, and that is it. She did not have a personality, a life, and experience outside of that disability. And that really pissed me off, in which y'all probably, if you haven't seen my recent reads, I really do talk about this a lot towards the end of the recent reads, which you can find the timestamp in that video, where the author wrote that she originally was going to give the character rib damage, right? But then her editor said, no, you should create this and make this an internal conflict. Let's make her a diabetic. Huh? You see what I'm saying here? That's why these questions are important, because are you writing it for purpose? Is there a real true reason why you want to tell the story? Or are you just doing it to do it for the sake of doing it? Because then you end up with books like Jumper, where the character is not fully developed, and you know that the book is going to be promoted because you're selling it as sapphic romance included somewhere in the book with a main character that has type 1 diabetes. Those are selling points now. regardless of whether there are good intentions, whether the research has been done, or the people who have type 1 diabetes, people who have been in sapphic relationships have been consulted. It's such a hard conversation, but at the end of the day, I think it is a necessary conversation that does require a lot of nuance and a lot of soul searching and a lot of insight. And it's not super black and white, because you know, we run into, like, if everybody just stuck to writing their own experiences, everything would be autobiographical. People have said that, and I get where they're coming from, but at the same time, when you see things like this where people are not asking themselves these questions, then we fall into the issue of, you're doing this for brownie points and it's harmful to the community because you end up with horrible representation. So honestly, y'all, like, those are just kind of my thoughts. I could spend so much time talking about this, but I don't want to keep you here forever. I just wanted to see, like, what were y'all's thoughts? Like, explicitly, like, do you feel like authors should be able to write outside of their lived experience? Let me know in the comments below. Keep it classy. I was in it. Just keep it classy. We can agree to disagree. Everybody's adults here. Keep it classy and respectful. Always. Always, 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 always. Anyway, y'all, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content, hit the subscribe button. Click the bell for notification. If you're interested in following me on social media or supporting the channel, all the links will be down in the description box below, and I'll be back with another video soon.